Racist cop slams black CIA agent against a car, but the prison gates welcomed him. In this eye-opening video, we delve into a shocking incident involving a black woman who was unjustly tied to a pole by racist police officers. This harrowing event exposes the deep-seated issues of racial profiling and abuse of power that still persist in our society today. The video sheds light on how racial discrimination continues to affect individuals and communities, highlighting the urgent need for systemic change. If you are enthusiastic about this narrative, please inform us. If you appreciated the video, press 1. If not, select 0. Your feedback genuinely motivates me to collect additional uplifting and significant narratives.
Ava Johnson, a seasoned CIA operative with years of experience in counterterrorism and covert operations, was known for her razor-sharp instincts and unwavering resolve. She had spent the past decade navigating high-stakes missions across the globe, dismantling threats and gathering intelligence vital to national security. But tonight she wasn't operating under the cover of darkness in a hostile territory or coordinating a complex sting operation. Tonight, she was simply trying to return home after successfully completing a classified mission that had stretched her endurance and patience to the limit. The small suburban neighborhood she found herself in seemed tranquil, a stark contrast to the chaos she had just left behind. Yet, her trained mind never allowed her to completely relax. Even here, her instincts warned her to stay alert, to be aware of her surroundings. Ava wasn't dressed to stand out. Wearing a simple leather jacket, dark jeans, and sneakers, she appeared like any other resident of the area. Her car, a mid-range sedan that wouldn't draw attention, was parked a block away. She had stopped at a local convenience store to pick up a bottle of water and a snack, an ordinary task that felt almost surreal given the events of the past 48 hours. The fluorescent lights inside the store flickered slightly, casting a faint hum over the quiet chatter of the cashier and a couple of customers. Ava moved with precision, grabbing her items quickly and heading toward the counter. She was tired, her body yearning for rest, but her mind remained sharp, constantly scanning for anything out of the ordinary. As she paid for her purchases, she felt a prickling at the back of her neck, a sensation she had learned never to ignore. Glancing sideways, she noticed a police officer, tall and broad-shouldered, entering the store. His uniform was crisp, his badge gleaming under the store's harsh lighting. His name tag read Officer Dan Marshall. He moved with the kind of authority that bordered on arrogance, his eyes scanning the room before landing on Ava. For a split second, their gazes locked. Ava's heart rate remained steady, but she didn't like the look in his eyes. It wasn't the usual casual glance of someone acknowledging another person's presence. It was sharp, scrutinizing, and laced with something she couldn't quite put her finger on yet. She broke eye contact first, turning back to the cashier and thanking him as she collected her change. Marshall watched her closely, his mind already working overtime. The neighborhood was predominantly white, and while he wouldn't openly admit it, he had always harbored a deep-seated suspicion toward anyone who didn't fit in. Seeing Ava, a black woman with a calm but confident demeanor, immediately put him on edge. "What's she doing here?" he thought. "She doesn't look like she's from around here." His eyes narrowed as he noticed the faint outline of something in her jacket pocket. It could have been a phone or nothing at all, but to Marshall, it was enough to ignite his suspicions. He prided himself on his gut instinct, which had been nothing more than a convenient excuse for his unchecked biases. Tonight, Ava was about to become his target. Ava exited the store and headed toward her car, keeping her pace steady but purposeful. She felt the officer's eyes on her as she walked, and her instincts were now on high alert. She wasn't carrying anything that could compromise her mission, but the nature of her work made her inherently cautious. She reached her car and unlocked it with a click of her key fob, sliding into the driver's seat and placing the bag of items on the passenger side. Before she could start the engine, a sudden beam of headlights illuminated her rearview mirror. A patrol car had pulled up behind her, blocking her exit. Ava sighed internally. She hadn't done anything to warrant attention, and this felt more like a deliberate provocation than a routine check. Stepping out of the patrol car, Marshall adjusted his utility belt and approached Ava's window with deliberate slowness, his flashlight in hand. The beam of light shone directly into her face as she rolled down the window. He didn't even bother with a polite introduction. "Evening," he said curtly, his tone already carrying an air of condescension. "Mind telling me what you're doing in this area?" Ava remained calm, her expression neutral. "Just picking up a few things from the store and heading home," she replied, her voice steady. She didn't offer any additional information, knowing from experience that over-explaining often made things worse in these situations. Marshall's eyes flicked to the interior of her car, scanning the seats and the dashboard. "This your car?" he asked, his tone making it clear that he doubted it. "Yes," Ava replied, keeping her answers short and direct. She wasn't going to give him any ammunition to escalate the situation further. Still, she couldn't ignore the growing tension in the air. Marshall's demeanor wasn't that of an officer conducting a routine stop. It was of someone looking for a reason to assert control. "License and registration," he demanded, the flashlight still pointed directly at her face. Ava complied, reaching into her glove compartment and pulling out the documents. She moved slowly, deliberately, ensuring her actions couldn't be misconstrued. As she handed over the paperwork, she noticed the faint smirk on Marshall's face, as though he had already decided she was guilty of something. Marshall took the documents and stepped back toward his patrol car, leaving Ava to sit in silence. She could see him through her side mirror, talking into his radio and typing something into the onboard computer. The minutes dragged on and Ava's patience began to thin. She knew she had done nothing wrong, but she also knew that confrontations like this rarely ended quickly or cleanly. Her mind raced through her options. Should she reveal her CIA credentials? No, that was a last resort. Drawing attention to her position could jeopardize not only her safety but also the integrity of the mission she had just completed. Marshall returned, his expression unreadable. He handed back her license but held onto the registration. "Mind stepping out of the car?" he asked, though it wasn't a request. Ava's jaw tightened, but she masked her irritation. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, her voice maintaining its calm edge. "Just routine," he replied, but his tone betrayed him. This wasn't routine. This was personal. Ava could see it in his eyes, the need to assert dominance, to flex his authority. She took a deep breath, unbuckled her seatbelt, and stepped out of the car. Her movements were controlled, almost graceful, as she faced Marshall under the harsh glare of his flashlight. Marshall stepped closer, invading her personal space. He was taller than her by several inches, but Ava's presence was unshaken. "You're acting awfully calm for someone being questioned by the police," he said, his voice low and accusatory. "I have no reason to be anything but calm," Ava replied evenly. "I haven't done anything wrong." Her composure only seemed to aggravate him further. Marshall took another step closer, his hand resting on the holster of his gun. Ava's instincts screamed at her to be ready, to prepare for the worst. She had seen men like him before, men who let their egos and biases dictate their actions. She wasn't going to let him control the narrative, but she also wasn't going to make the first move. This was a game of patience, and she was far better at it than he could ever be. Ava stood calmly on the side of the road, the cool night air brushing against her face as Officer Marshall continued to loom over her. His posture radiated tension and aggression, his hand still resting near the holster of his gun, as though he was expecting her to lash out. But Ava wasn't an ordinary civilian. She wasn't going to play into his expectations or make a move that could give him the justification he seemed to be looking for. Years of training in high-pressure situations had taught her to read people, and she could see right through him. Marshall wasn't operating from a place of duty, he was operating from a place of misplaced pride and unchecked prejudice. "What's in your jacket pocket?" Marshall asked, his voice sharp and demanding. The question caught Ava slightly off guard, but her face remained an unreadable mask. "My phone," she replied simply, her tone steady. She didn't move to show him or confirm. She knew better than to make sudden movements around a man who was clearly looking for a reason to escalate the situation. Marshall narrowed his eyes, clearly unsatisfied with her answer. "You mind pulling it out?" Nice and slow. Ava sighed internally, knowing exactly where this was going. She moved deliberately, her hands visible at all times, and retrieved her phone from the inside pocket of her jacket. It was a sleek, unassuming device, nothing that should have raised suspicion, but Marshall wasn't interested in logic. He was interested in control. "Is that all?" he pressed, his tone dripping with accusation. "Nothing else in there I should know about?" "No, officer," Ava replied coolly. "That's all." Marshall stared at her for a long moment, his gaze searching her face for any sign of weakness or deceit. When he didn't find what he was looking for, his frustration visibly grew. He stepped back, his flashlight sweeping over her car. "Pop the trunk," he ordered. Ava's calm exterior faltered slightly, though she quickly regained control. "Do you have a warrant?" she asked, her voice still polite but with a firmer edge. Marshall's smirk returned, though it was colder this time. "You don't need to make this difficult, ma'am. Just open the trunk, and we'll be done here." Ava folded her arms across her chest, her stance unwavering. "With all due respect, officer, I know my rights. You don't have probable cause, and unless you're planning to arrest me, I'm not obligated to comply." Her words hung in the air like a challenge, and for a brief moment, Marshall seemed taken aback. He hadn't expected her to push back, especially not with such calm confidence. But instead of backing down, her defiance only fueled his anger. He stepped closer again, his hand now fully resting on the grip of his gun. "You're awfully knowledgeable for someone who claims they've got nothing to hide," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Makes me wonder what you're so afraid of." Ava could feel the tension in the air thickening, but she refused to be intimidated. She knew she was walking a fine line, but she also knew she couldn't afford to show any sign of fear. "I'm not afraid, officer," she said, meeting his gaze head-on. "I'm just aware of my rights." "Are you?" Marshall's eyes flashed with something dangerous, a mix of rage and humiliation. He was losing control of the narrative, and he hated it. Without another word, he turned and stalked back toward his patrol car, muttering something into his radio. Ava stayed where she was, her posture rigid but composed, as she watched him. She could only imagine what he was saying, but she knew it wasn't good. Moments later, another patrol car pulled up, its red and blue lights casting an ominous glow over the quiet suburban street. Two officers stepped out, one of them younger and visibly uncertain, the other older and more seasoned. Marshall approached them, gesturing animatedly in Ava's direction as he spoke. She couldn't hear the words, but the younger officer glanced at her briefly, his expression shifting from curiosity to something closer to unease. After a brief discussion, the older officer, whose name tag read Jenkins, approached Ava. Unlike Marshall, his demeanor wasn't immediately hostile, but there was a guardedness in his posture that put her on edge. "Ma'am," he began, his tone more measured than Marshall's but still carrying an undertone of authority. "We're going to need you to step away from the vehicle while we conduct a search." Ava's jaw tightened. "I've already explained to Officer Marshall that he doesn't have probable cause, and I'd like to know on what grounds you're planning to search my car." Jenkins hesitated, glancing back at Marshall, who was standing a few feet away with his arms crossed and a triumphant look on his face. It was clear that Jenkins wasn't entirely comfortable with the situation, but he also wasn't willing to openly challenge his colleague. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in the area," Jenkins said finally, his words careful and rehearsed. "Your vehicle matches the description of one that was seen leaving the scene of a potential crime." Ava raised an eyebrow, her skepticism evident. "And what crime would that be?" Jenkins hesitated again, and for a moment, Ava thought he might actually back down. But then Marshall stepped forward, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Enough with the questions," he snapped. "You're not in a position to make demands. Now step aside, or we'll do this the hard way." Ava turned her attention back to Marshall, her expression hardening. She had been patient, cooperative even, but his tone and his blatant disregard for protocol were pushing her to her limit. She knew she couldn't afford to escalate the situation further, but she also couldn't let them trample over her rights without consequence. "Fine," she said, stepping away from the car. "But I want it on record that this is an unlawful search." Marshall's smirk widened. "Noted," he said, his tone mocking as he moved toward the car. Ava stood silently as Marshall and Jenkins began searching her vehicle, her mind racing through her options. She knew they wouldn't find anything incriminating, but the very act of the search felt like a violation. It wasn't just about her car or her rights. It was about the principle of the matter. Men like Marshall thrived on the power they held over others, and she couldn't let him think he had won. The younger officer, who had remained silent up until now, finally spoke. "Ma'am, do you mind telling us where you're coming from?" he asked, his tone tentative. Ava turned to him, her expression softening slightly. She could see the unease in his eyes, the faint flicker of doubt that suggested he wasn't entirely comfortable with the situation. "Just running errands," she replied simply. "Nothing more." The officer nodded, but before he could say anything further, Marshall emerged from her car holding a small black device. His expression was triumphant as he held it up for everyone to see. "What's this?" he demanded. Ava's stomach tightened as she recognized the device's secured transmitter used to relay sensitive information. It was part of her mission. And while it wasn't illegal, it was certainly not something she wanted falling into the wrong hands. "It's a personal item," she said carefully, keeping her tone neutral. "Nothing that concerns you." Marshall's smirk returned, more smug than ever. "We'll see about that," he said, turning the device over in his hands. "Looks suspicious to me." Ava could feel the situation spiraling further out of control, and she knew she needed to act quickly. She couldn't let them take the device or use it as an excuse to detain her further. Taking a deep breath, she squared her shoulders and prepared to do what she did best: take control of the narrative before it was too late. Ava stood rooted to the spot as Officer Marshall turned the small black transmitter over in his hands, his face twisted into a smug expression of triumph. The device wasn't just any piece of technology, it was a classified transmitter, encoded with layers of encryption that only high-level operatives like herself could access. She knew that if Marshall continued to handle it, the situation would escalate in ways she could no longer control. The transmitter wasn't something she could easily explain away, nor was it something she could let slip into the hands of someone so reckless and prejudiced. Her mind raced through her options as Marshall's fingers hovered over the activation switch. He had no idea what he was holding, and that ignorance was more dangerous than anything else in the moment. "What exactly is this, ma'am?" Marshall asked, his tone laced with feigned curiosity, but undercut by his clear intent to assert dominance. He glanced at her, his eyes narrowing as if daring her to come up with a plausible explanation. "Some kind of fancy gadget. Doesn't look like something the average person would carry around." "It's private property," Ava replied, her voice calm but firm. She kept her gaze locked on his, refusing to give him the satisfaction of showing fear or hesitation. "And it's not something you're authorized to handle." Marshall's smirk widened at her response, his grip tightening on the device. "Not authorized? You think you can tell me what I'm authorized to do?" He took a step closer to her, holding the transmitter up as if to make a point. "Let me guess you're one of those types who think you're above the law." Ava didn't flinch, though every fiber of her being wanted to knock the device out of his hand and end this farce. Years of training had taught her the value of patience, of waiting for the right moment to act. But this was testing even her limits. She measured her words carefully, knowing that anything she said could either defuse the situation or push it closer to the brink. "I'm not above the law, officer," she said evenly, "but I do know when it's being misused." Her statement hit its mark, and she saw the flicker of anger flash across Marshall's face. He wasn't used to being challenged, least of all by someone who wasn't visibly intimidated by him. He turned to the other officers, holding the device out for them to see. "What do you make of this?" he asked, his voice louder now, clearly performing for an audience. "Doesn't look like your average cell phone, does it?" Officer Jenkins, the older and seemingly more level-headed of the two other officers, stepped forward to examine the device. He looked at Ava, his brow furrowed in concern. "Ma'am, I think it would be best if you explained what this is," he said, his tone far less confrontational than Marshall's but still carrying a note of suspicion. Ava met Jenkins's gaze, assessing him quickly. He didn't seem as hot-headed or biased as Marshall, but he also didn't appear willing to defy his colleague outright. She could use that to her advantage. "It's a secure communication device," she said, her tone steady but with a deliberate vagueness. "Nothing illegal, I assure you. It's for work." "Work?" Marshall interrupted, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "And what kind of work requires a gadget like this? You a spy or something?" He laughed at his own comment, but there was an undercurrent of menace in his tone that made it clear he wasn't joking. "Maybe you're up to something you shouldn't be, and that's why you're so calm right now." Ava's patience was wearing thin, but she forced herself to remain composed. "I'm not obligated to answer that," she said, her voice still measured but with a sharper edge now. "What I am obligated to do is inform you that mishandling that device could have serious consequences for you and for others." Her words seemed to unsettle Jenkins, who glanced at Marshall as if silently questioning the wisdom of continuing to escalate the situation. But Marshall was too far gone, his ego driving him to push harder. He took another step toward Ava, closing the gap between them until he was uncomfortably close. "You think you can intimidate me with your fancy words?" he sneered. "You're in my jurisdiction now, lady, and you'll do as I say." Ava held her ground, her expression unyielding. She was calculating her next move when Marshall suddenly raised the transmitter, his thumb hovering dangerously close to the activation button. The sight sent a jolt of alarm through her. He didn't know what he was doing, but if he accidentally triggered the device, the encrypted contents could become corrupted or worse. The signal it emitted could draw unwanted attention to her location. "Don't," she said sharply, her calm demeanor finally giving way to urgency. She stepped forward, her hand instinctively reaching out, though she stopped herself short of making contact. "I'm warning you, officer." That's not a toy. Marshall froze for a moment, clearly caught off guard by the shift in her tone. But instead of heeding her warning, he used it as fuel to further assert his control. He grinned, his thumb brushing against the button, as if daring her to stop him. Not a toy, huh? Then maybe you should have thought twice about carrying it around. Put it down, Ava said, her voice now commanding. She was done playing along, done trying to de-escalate through reason. She straightened her posture, allowing a fraction of the authority she usually kept concealed to surface. I won't ask again. The shift in her demeanor was palpable, and even Marshall seemed momentarily taken aback. But his pride wouldn't let him back down. Or what? He taunted, his grin widening. What are you going to do about it? Before he could react, Ava moved. It wasn't a strike. She wasn't about to attack a police officer outright, but it was swift and deliberate. She reached for the transmitter, her hand closing around it in a firm grip that left no room for argument. Marshall tried to yank it back, but her strength surprised him, and for a brief moment, they were locked in a silent struggle. Let go, she said, her voice low and lethal. This isn't a game. Marshall's face darkened, and he released the device abruptly, causing Ava to stumble slightly but regain her footing almost instantly. The tension in the air was electric, the other officers watching with a mix of shock and uncertainty. Marshall's hand went to his gun, his fingers curling around the grip, but he didn't draw it yet. You just assaulted an officer, he said, his voice shaking with barely contained rage. That's resisting arrest. Ava took a step back, her hands raised slightly to show she wasn't a threat. But her eyes never left Marshall's, and her expression was anything but submissive. I didn't assault you, she said, her tone razor sharp. I stopped you from making a very big mistake. And if you want to escalate this further, I suggest you think very carefully about the consequences. Marshall's chest heaved as he glared at her, his face red with anger and humiliation. For a moment it seemed as though he might actually draw his weapon, but Jenkins stepped in, placing a hand on Marshall's shoulder in a gesture of restraint. Dan, Jenkins said quietly, his voice firm but calm. That's enough. Marshall turned to Jenkins, his expression incredulous. You're taking her side, he demanded, his voice rising. You saw what she just did. I saw her stop you from doing something reckless. Jenkins replied evenly. And I think we need to take a step back before this gets out of hand. Ava watched the exchange carefully, her adrenaline still coursing through her veins. She knew she had pushed the situation to its breaking point, but she also knew it had been necessary. Marshall wasn't going to back down on his own, and Jenkins was her best chance at diffusing the immediate threat. Officer Jenkins, she said, addressing him directly for the first time. You seem like someone who values protocol. So let me make this very clear, I am not a threat, but if your colleague continues to act without cause, this will become a much bigger issue than it already is. Jenkins looked at her, his brow furrowed in thought. He seemed to be weighing her words carefully, his gaze flickering between her and Marshall. Finally he nodded, though the tension in his posture remained. All right, he said. Let's all take a breath and figure this out. But Marshall wasn't ready to let it go. He shrugged off Jenkins's hand, his expression livid. Figure this out. She's hiding something, Jenkins. I know it. And I'm not letting her walk away until we get to the bottom of it. You're not the one making that call, Jenkins replied, his voice hardening. Stand down, Dan. The standoff between the two officers was almost as tense as the one between Ava and Marshall had been. For a moment it seemed as though Marshall might push back, but eventually he stepped away, though his glare never left Ava. This isn't over, he muttered. No, Ava said quietly, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "It isn't." Ava stood her ground, her heart beating steadily as Officer Marshall reluctantly backed away, his face a storm of anger and humiliation. She could tell he wasn't done with her. Men like him rarely let go of their need to assert dominance, but for now, the immediate physical threat had been neutralized. The transmitter was safely back in her possession, and while she'd managed to prevent Marshall from making a potentially catastrophic mistake, the tension in the air was far from dissipating. Officer Jenkins, who had taken on the role of the reluctant voice of reason, was now left to navigate the aftermath of what had just unfolded. The third officer, the younger and clearly inexperienced one, stood awkwardly to the side, his gaze darting between Ava, Marshall, and Jenkins like he was trying to piece together a puzzle he didn't have all the pieces for. "I think we all need to take a step back and reevaluate this situation," Jenkins said, his tone calm but firm. He turned to Ava, his expression guarded but not hostile. "Ma'am, I'd like to ask you to remain here while we sort this out. No one's being detained yet, but I think we can agree this situation has escalated unnecessarily." Ava inclined her head slightly, a gesture that conveyed both agreement and caution. "I have no intention of going anywhere, officer," she said. "But I hope you're aware that this escalation hasn't been on my part." Jenkins's lips tightened, and for a moment, Ava thought she saw a flicker of understanding in his eyes. He gave a small nod, then turned to Marshall, who was still glaring at Ava like she was his personal nemesis. "Dan," Jenkins said quietly but firmly, "we need to take a beat here. Let's regroup and figure out the best way to proceed." Marshall's jaw clenched so tightly that Ava could see the muscle twitching beneath his skin. "The best way to proceed," he snapped, "is to figure out what she's hiding. She's got something she doesn't want us to see, and we both know it. You saw the way she grabbed that thing. That's not normal behavior. She grabbed it because you were handling it recklessly," Jenkins countered, his voice still calm but now carrying an edge of steel. "And unless you have something concrete to justify your suspicions, we can't keep pushing this." "She's lying," Marshall growled, his eyes narrowing. "I know it." Jenkins sighed, clearly exasperated, but he didn't argue further. Instead, he turned back to Ava, who had remained perfectly still throughout the exchange. "Ma'am," he said, "you mentioned that the device you're carrying is related to your work. I understand you may not want to discuss the specifics, but any information you can provide would help clarify the situation." Ava met his gaze, weighing her options. She could sense that Jenkins wasn't as blinded by prejudice as Marshall, but she also knew he wasn't fully on her side. He was trying to maintain control, to keep things from spiraling further, but that didn't mean he trusted her. And why would he? From his perspective, she was just another civilian refusing to comply with police orders, even if the reality was far more complex. "It's a secure communication device," she said finally, her tone measured. "I work in a field that requires discretion, and that device is part of my job. It doesn't pose any threat to you or anyone else, but it is sensitive, which is why I reacted the way I did when Officer Marshall mishandled it." Jenkins frowned, clearly unsatisfied with her vague explanation, but he didn't press further. Marshall, on the other hand, let out a derisive laugh. "Discretion," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "That's a nice way of saying you've got something to hide." Ava's patience, already stretched thin, was wearing dangerously close to breaking. She took a slow breath, forcing herself to maintain her composure. "I've already explained myself, officer," she said, her voice sharp but controlled. "If that's not enough for you, then perhaps you should consider why you're so determined to see me as a threat." The barb hit its mark. and Marshall's face darkened with fury. He took a step toward her, but Jenkins intercepted him, placing a hand on his chest to stop him. "That's enough," Jenkins said firmly. "We're not doing this." For a moment it seemed as though Marshall might push past him, but then he stopped, his hands balling into fists at his sides. He turned away, muttering something under his breath that Ava couldn't make out but could guess wasn't flattering. Jenkins watched him for a moment, then turned back to Ava, his expression carefully neutral. "I'm going to need you to stay here while we run some checks," he said. "I understand your frustration, but we need to make sure everything is above board. I hope you can understand that." Ava nodded, though her mind was already racing. "Take all the time you need," she said, her tone even. "I'll be here." Jenkins gave her a small nod, then motioned for the younger officer to follow him as he walked back to the patrol car. Marshall remained where he was, his back to Ava, but she could feel the waves of hostility radiating off him. She turned her attention back to the patrol car, watching as Jenkins and the younger officer spoke in hushed tones. She couldn't hear what they were saying, but she could see the tension in Jenkins's posture and the uncertainty in the younger officer's movements. It was clear that not everyone on the scene was on the same page. As they spoke, Ava's mind shifted to the transmitter in her pocket. She had managed to reclaim it, but the device was still a liability. If this situation dragged on much longer, there was a real risk that its presence would raise more questions than she could afford to answer. And if the wrong people got involved, whether it was Marshall escalating things further or someone higher up the chain deciding to intervene, it could compromise not only her mission but her safety as well. Her hand brushed against the transmitter through the fabric of her jacket, and she considered her options. The device had a fail-safe, a feature designed to erase its contents if it fell into the wrong hands, but activating it would require her to input a specific sequence, and doing so in front of the officers would be impossible without drawing attention. She needed a distraction, something that would give her the time and space to act without arousing suspicion. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of raised voices. She looked up to see Marshall and Jenkins arguing near the patrol car, their body language tense and aggressive. The younger officer stood off to the side, clearly uncomfortable but not intervening. Ava couldn't make out their words, but she could tell from Jenkins's expression that he was reaching the end of his patience. The argument escalated, and then, to Ava's surprise, Jenkins turned and started walking back toward her. Marshall followed a step behind, his face set in a scowl. Jenkins stopped a few feet away from Ava, his expression carefully composed, but she could see the frustration in his eyes. "Ma'am," he said, his tone more clipped now, "I'm going to have to ask you to hand over the device for further inspection. This isn't a request. We need to confirm that it doesn't pose a risk." Ava's jaw tightened. She had been expecting this, but that didn't make it any less infuriating. "And what grounds do you have for confiscating my property?" she asked, her voice calm but edged with steel. "I've already explained what it is and why it's important. Unless you have probable cause to believe I've committed a crime, I suggest you reconsider." Jenkins's expression hardened. "We're past the point of probable cause," he said. "This situation has escalated, and I need to ensure the safety of everyone involved. Now, please hand over the device." Ava's mind raced. She could see the determination in Jenkins's eyes and the simmering rage in Marshall's. They weren't going to back down. And if she continued to resist, things would only get worse. But giving up the transmitter wasn't an option, not without jeopardizing everything she had worked for. She took a deep breath, her hand moving to her pocket. "All right," she said, her tone measured. "But I need you to understand that mishandling this device could have serious consequences." Jenkins nodded. though his expression remained guarded. Understood. Ava pulled the transmitter from her pocket, holding it out with deliberate slowness. As Jenkins reached for it, she made her move. With a flick of her wrist, she activated the device's failsafe, inputting the sequence in one fluid motion before handing it over. The transmitter emitted a soft beep, its internal systems already working to wipe its contents. Jenkins took the device, his brow furrowing as he examined it. "What did you just do?" he asked, his tone sharp. "Secured it," Ava replied simply. "You wanted to make sure it wasn't a threat. Now it isn't." Jenkins's expression darkened, but before he could respond, the transmitter emitted another beep, louder this time. Marshall, who had been standing a few feet away, stepped forward, his hand on his gun. "What the hell is that?" he demanded. Ava didn't flinch. "It's just completing its protocol," she said. "Nothing to worry about." But the tension in the air said otherwise. Jenkins turned the transmitter over in his hands, his frown deepening. "Dan," he said, his voice tight, "step back." Marshall ignored him, his eyes locked on Ava. "What did you do?" he hissed. "What's it doing?" Ava met his gaze, her expression unyielding. "Exactly what it was designed to do," she said. "Protect its contents." Before Marshall could respond, the transmitter emitted one final beep, then went silent. Jenkins stared at it, his expression a mix of confusion and frustration. Marshall, however, looked ready to explode. "This isn't over," he growled, his hand tightening on his gun. "Not by a long shot." Jenkins stared at the transmitter in his hand, his expression a mixture of confusion and frustration. The soft beeping had stopped, and the device now appeared inert, but the tension in the air was anything but. Ava watched him carefully, noting the way his eyes flicked back to her, narrowing slightly as he processed what had just happened. Meanwhile, Marshall's body was rigid with barely contained fury, his hand gripping his holstered weapon so tightly that the leather creaked under the strain. His glare was fixed on Ava, his face flushed red, and it was clear that his patience had entirely evaporated. "You just tampered with evidence," Marshall growled, taking a step toward Ava. His voice was low, but the barely contained rage in it made every syllable drip with menace. "I don't care what you think you're hiding, that stunt you just pulled. That's obstruction of justice." Ava didn't flinch. Instead, she straightened her posture, her calm demeanor only serving to stoke Marshall's fury further. "Obstruction of justice," she repeated, her tone sharp and deliberate. "I informed you multiple times that this device is sensitive and that mishandling it could have repercussions. You chose to ignore that warning. If anything, it's your actions that are irresponsible, officer." Marshall's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Ava thought he might finally snap. But Jenkins, still holding the transmitter, interjected before the situation could escalate further. "Dan," he said firmly, his voice carrying a warning step back. Marshall turned on Jenkins, his eyes blazing with indignation. "Step back? Are you serious? She just admitted to tampering with whatever this thing is, and you're telling me to step back? She's playing us, Jenkins. She knows exactly what she's doing." "Maybe she does," Jenkins replied, his tone cool but resolute. "And maybe we need to figure out what exactly is going on before we make this worse." Ava watched the exchange closely, noting the tension between the two officers. It was clear that Jenkins was trying to de-escalate, but his authority over Marshall was tenuous at best. She needed to act quickly before Marshall's temper pushed him into doing something irreversible. "This isn't about obstruction," Ava said, her voice cutting through the charged silence. "This is about control. Officer Marshall isn't interested in the truth, he's interested in proving a point. And if you let him keep escalating this, the consequences won't just fall on me. They'll fall on your entire department. Jenkins turned to her, his expression tightening. Is that a threat? He asked, his voice cautious but laced with suspicion. No, Ava replied, meeting his gaze evenly. It's a reality. You think I'm some random person you can intimidate into compliance, but I've been more than patient, more than cooperative. If this continues, you'll be forcing my hand, and you don't want that. Marshall let out a sharp, derisive laugh. Forcing your hand? You hear that, Jenkins? She thinks she's got leverage. Well, I've got news for you. Lady, you're in no position to make threats. Ava's expression didn't change, but inside, she could feel the tension mounting. She had no intention of making threats. She didn't need to. The moment Marshall and Jenkins had crossed the line, the wheels of a larger machine had already begun to turn. All she had to do was hold her ground until that machine arrived. The younger officer, who had been silent for most of the confrontation, finally spoke up. His voice was hesitant, but there was a note of unease in it that made both Ava and Jenkins glance in his direction. Sergeant, he said, addressing Jenkins. I don't think this is going the way it should. Maybe we should, call this in. Get someone higher up involved. Marshall rounded on him instantly. Stay out of this, kid, he snapped. You don't know what you're talking about. But Jenkins seemed to consider the suggestion, his brow furrowing as he looked between Ava and the transmitter in his hand. Dan, he said slowly, maybe he's right. This is above our pay grade. If what she's saying is true, and this thing really is as sensitive as she claims, then we're in over our heads. We're not in over anything, Marshall shot back, his voice rising. She's bluffing Jenkins. That's all this is, a bluff. And the moment we give in, she wins. Ava's patience was nearly at its limit. She could feel the weight of the transmitter in Jenkins's hand, the device now wiped clean but still a potent symbol of the high stakes at play. She had no doubt that Marshall would seize on any excuse to escalate further, but Jenkins was still a potential ally, however tenuous. She needed to appeal to his sense of reason before the situation spiraled completely out of control. Sergeant Jenkins, she said, her voice firm but not unkind. I understand that you're trying to navigate a difficult situation, but the truth is, this device isn't something you can afford to mishandle. You don't know what it is, and you don't know who I am. But I promise you, if you push this any further, you'll regret it, not because of me, but because of what it will mean for you and your department. Jenkins stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly as he turned to Marshall. Dan, I'm calling it in. Marshall's face turned an alarming shade of red. Like hell you are, he shouted. We've got this under control. You call it in. And it'll look like we can't handle our own jurisdiction. It'll look like we're doing the right thing, Jenkins countered, his voice sharp. And frankly, I don't care how it looks if it keeps this from blowing up in our faces. Without waiting for Marshall's response, Jenkins pulled out his radio and began speaking into it, relaying the situation to dispatch in clipped, professional tones. Marshall looked as though he might explode, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides as he glared at Ava with undisguised hatred. You think you're clever, don't you? He spat, his voice low and venomous. You think you've won. This isn't a game, Ava replied, her tone icy. And if you keep treating it like one, you're going to lose more than just an argument. Marshall's lip curled in a snarl, but before he could respond, the sound of distant sirens cut through the night air. Ava felt a wave of relief wash over her. The cavalry was coming, though not in the way Marshall or Jenkins might have expected. Within moments, an unmarked black SUV pulled up to the scene, its windows tinted so dark that the occupants were invisible until the doors opened. Two men in sharp suits stepped out, their movements precise and deliberate. They didn't speak as they approached, but their presence immediately shifted the dynamic. Even Marshall seemed to falter, his bravado momentarily slipping as he took in their imposing figures. "Officers," one of the men said, his tone cool and authoritative, "we're here to take over from here." "You're relieved." Marshall's mouth opened, then closed, his confusion and frustration evident. "Relieved?" he sputtered. "Who the hell are you?" The man reached into his jacket and produced a badge, flashing it briefly before tucking it away. "Department of Homeland Security," he said. "This individual and her equipment are now under federal jurisdiction. Step aside." Jenkins looked visibly relieved, though he tried to hide it. Marshall, on the other hand, looked as though he might explode. "Federal jurisdiction? Are you kidding me? She's..." "Enough," the agent interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You've done your part. We'll take it from here." Marshall's face turned a deeper shade of red, but he didn't argue further. He stepped back, his fists clenched at his sides, as the agents turned their attention to Ava. One of them gave her a brief nod, a subtle acknowledgement that everything was under control. "Ma'am," the agent said quietly, "we'll escort you from here. Let's wrap this up." Ava nodded, her relief tempered by the lingering tension in the air. She stepped toward the SUV, ignoring the burning glare she could feel from Marshall as she walked past him. The agents flanked her, their presence a silent but unmistakable statement. The situation was no longer in local hands. As the SUV pulled away, Ava allowed herself a brief glance back at the scene. Marshall was still standing there, his posture stiff with rage, while Jenkins looked as though he'd just narrowly avoided a disaster. The younger officer stood awkwardly to the side, his expression unreadable. Ava turned her attention forward, her mind already shifting to the next steps. The transmitter was secure, the situation had been contained, and she had managed to maintain her composure throughout. But she knew this wasn't over, not for her, and certainly not for Marshall. Men like him rarely let go of their grudges. And while he might not have the power to come after her directly, she had no doubt that he would try to make someone pay for the humiliation he'd just endured. For now, though, she allowed herself a small moment of satisfaction. The game had changed, and the rules were no longer his to dictate. As the black SUV sped away from the scene, Ava allowed herself a moment of reflection, the tension in her shoulders slowly easing. She knew the immediate danger had been neutralized, but the events of the night were far from over. The transmitter's failsafe had been successfully activated, erasing any sensitive data that might have compromised her mission, but the encounter with Officer Marshall and his unchecked aggression lingered in her mind. She had encountered men like him before, men who thrived on power and used their positions to impose their will, no matter the consequences. But this time was different. This time he had overreached, and Ava wasn't about to let it go unnoticed. The agent seated beside her, a silent and imposing figure with a calm demeanor, finally broke the silence. "You handled that well," he said, his voice low and measured. "Most people would have cracked under that kind of pressure." Ava turned her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "I don't crack," she said simply. "But this isn't over. That Officer Marshall, he's a loose cannon. If we don't do something about him, he's going to hurt someone else." The agent nodded, his gaze steady. "We're already on it. His actions tonight won't go unanswered. We've got everything we need to make sure this doesn't disappear into the system." Ava knew what he meant. The federal presence at the scene had served multiple purposes: to extract her safely, to retrieve the transmitter, and to ensure that the incident was documented from start to finish. The agents had been recording everything from the moment they arrived, capturing not only Marshall's behavior, but also the dynamics within the local police department. It was a calculated move, one that Ava appreciated but also found unsettling. While the situation was now firmly in the hands of higher authorities, she couldn't shake the feeling that Marshall's arrogance and aggression would make him a difficult opponent to silence. The SUV came to a stop outside a secure federal facility, its nondescript exterior blending seamlessly into the industrial surroundings. The agents escorted Ava inside, bypassing multiple security checkpoints until they reached a conference room deep within the building. The space was sparsely furnished, with a long table, a few chairs, and a large monitor mounted on the wall. A man in a crisp suit and a demeanor that screamed authority was already waiting for them. "Agent Johnson," he said, rising to his feet as Ava entered. His voice was calm but carried an undeniable weight. "You've had quite the evening." "More eventful than I planned," Ava replied, her tone even. She took a seat across from him, her sharp eyes assessing his every movement. "What's the status on Marshall?" The man, whose badge identified him as Director Kane, leaned back in his chair. "We've already initiated a full review of his actions tonight. Body cam footage, witness statements, the works. His aggression and misconduct are undeniable, and his colleagues' responses or lack thereof speak volumes. Marshall has a history of complaints, but this incident will be the tipping point." Ava folded her arms across her chest, her posture relaxed but her eyes steely. Complaints don't mean much if no one acts on them. "What's your plan to make sure this doesn't get swept under the rug?" Kane's expression didn't waver. Marshall's behavior tonight wasn't just a violation of protocol, it was a blatant abuse of power. "We've already flagged the department for an internal investigation, and we're coordinating with the DOI to ensure accountability. But there's more at play here than just one bad cop." Ava raised an eyebrow. "Meaning?" "Meaning," Kane said, his voice lowering slightly, "that this isn't an isolated case. Marshall's department has a pattern of systemic issues, and his actions tonight are just the latest symptom of a much larger problem. This is an opportunity to address those issues head-on, but it's going to require more than just disciplinary action against one officer." Ava nodded slowly, her mind turning over the implications of his words. She had suspected as much. Marshall's behavior, while extreme, wasn't entirely unique. He was a product of a broken system, one that enabled and even rewarded the kind of unchecked power he wielded so recklessly. But knowing that didn't make her any less determined to see him face the consequences of his actions. "And what about me?" she asked. "I was the target of his aggression. I won't let this slide without a fight." "You won't have to," Kane assured her. "Your role in this is clear. You handled yourself with professionalism and restraint, even under extreme provocation. We'll make sure your account is part of the official record. And if Marshall or anyone else tries to retaliate, they'll be answering to us." Ava's gaze sharpened. "Retaliation isn't my concern," she said. "Justice is. I don't want this to end with a slap on the wrist or a quiet reassignment. Men like Marshall thrive because they believe they're untouchable. It's time to prove them wrong." Kane nodded, his expression unreadable. "Understood. And you'll have our full support." The conversation shifted to logistics, with Kane and the agents outlining the steps that would be taken to hold Marshall accountable and address the broader issues within his department. Ava listened carefully, her mind racing through the possibilities. She knew the process wouldn't be quick or easy. Systemic change never was, but the wheels were in motion, and that was what mattered. As the meeting wrapped up, Kane rose to his feet and extended a hand. "You've done your part, Agent Johnson. Now, let us handle the rest. Ava shook his hand, her grip firm. Just make sure it gets done. As she left the facility, escorted once again by the agents, Ava allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. The night had been a whirlwind of tension and conflict, but she had emerged intact, her mission secured and her principles uncompromised. She had faced down a man who represented everything she despised about abuse of power, and she had held her own. But more than that, she had set in motion a chain of events that would reverberate far beyond this single encounter. The agents dropped her off at a safe location, her car waiting for her in the shadows of a quiet street. Ava climbed into the driver's seat, her mind already turning to the next steps. She knew she couldn't let her guard down, not yet. Marshall might be facing scrutiny now, but she had no doubt he would try to claw his way out of it, and she needed to be prepared for whatever came next. As she started the engine and pulled onto the empty road, her thoughts drifted to the other officers who had been there that night. Jenkins, the sergeant who had tried to maintain some semblance of order, had shown moments of reason, but his hesitation to challenge Marshall outright had been telling. And the younger officer, clearly inexperienced and unsure of how to handle the situation, had been little more than a bystander. They were both products of the same system that had enabled Marshall, and while they weren't as culpable, they weren't entirely blameless either. Ava's grip tightened on the steering wheel as she drove through the quiet streets. She knew the fight wasn't over, not for her, and not for the countless others who had faced similar injustices. But for now, she took solace in the knowledge that she had stood her ground, that she had refused to be silenced or intimidated. And as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, she allowed herself a small, fleeting smile. Marshall had thought he could break her, but he had underestimated her resolve. He had underestimated her strength. And now he was about to learn the hard way that some battles could only end one way, with justice. The fallout from the night's events was swift and unrelenting. By the time Ava had reached the safe house she used during missions, the gears of accountability had already begun to turn. Calls had been made, reports filed, and the wheels of justice set in motion. For all his bravado and aggression, Officer Dan Marshall was now at the center of an investigation that reached far beyond the scope of his department. Ava had made sure of it. But as she sat in the quiet of the dimly lit safe house, sipping on a glass of water to steady her nerves, she knew this wasn't just about one man. It was about a system that had let him thrive unchecked. And if there was one thing Ava excelled at, it was dismantling systems that caused harm. The first ripple came less than 24 hours after the incident. A high-ranking official from the Department of Justice personally reached out to Ava, not just to apologize but to assure her that every aspect of the night's events was being reviewed. Officer Marshall's record was under a microscope, and the initial findings painted a damning picture. A history of excessive force complaints, incidents of misconduct swept under the rug, and a pattern of racial profiling that had gone unaddressed for years. Marshall wasn't just a rogue officer, he was emblematic of a deeper rot within his department, a rot that could no longer be ignored. Agent Johnson, the Doe official, said during their call, his tone professional but deeply apologetic, "I want you to know that your actions last night may have prevented an even greater tragedy. We're committed to ensuring that justice is served and that this situation becomes a catalyst for real change." Ava listened in silence, her emotions held tightly in check. She had heard words like these before, well-meaning, but often hollow. Promises of change that faded as soon as the public eye shifted elsewhere. Still, she appreciated the effort, even if her trust in the system remained minimal. "I'll hold you to that," she replied, her tone measured. "This isn't just about accountability for one officer. It's about making sure this doesn't happen again. The official assured her that steps were being taken to conduct a full audit of Marshall's department, but Ava wasn't content to simply leave it in their hands. Using her network of contacts, she quietly reached out to civil rights organizations and legal advocates, ensuring that the incident would remain in the public eye. She knew how quickly stories like this could be buried, and she wasn't about to let Marshall or his department escape scrutiny. Meanwhile, the local police department was thrown into chaos. Officer Marshall was immediately placed on administrative leave, but the damage to his reputation was already done. The footage captured by body cameras, as well as statements from witnesses including his own colleagues, painted a picture of a man who had allowed his personal biases to override his duty. His fellow officers were forced to answer uncomfortable questions, not just about his actions but about their own complicity. Sergeant Jenkins, in particular, found himself under the spotlight, his reluctance to intervene seen as a failure of leadership. The media frenzy that followed was inevitable, though Ava herself avoided the limelight. She had no interest in becoming the face of the story, preferring to operate behind the scenes where she could be most effective. Still, the incident became a flashpoint, sparking debates about police accountability and systemic reform. Protests erupted in the city, with calls for greater oversight and the establishment of independent review boards to handle complaints against law enforcement. For Ava, the days that followed were a whirlwind of debriefings and strategy sessions. The CIA, while supportive, was understandably cautious about how much of her involvement could be disclosed. The transmitter, now safely back in the agency's possession, had been deemed secure, but the fallout from the incident had raised questions about how agents like Ava could better protect themselves in civilian encounters. It was a sobering reminder that even the most highly trained operatives weren't immune to the systemic issues that plague society. On the third day after the incident, Ava received an unexpected call from Sergeant Jenkins. His voice was subdued, lacking the authoritative edge it had carried during their initial confrontation. "Agent Johnson," he began, the hesitation in his tone palpable. "I wanted to apologize for the way things unfolded that night. I should have done more to de-escalate, and I take full responsibility for that." Ava was silent for a moment, processing his words. She had been prepared to write Jenkins off as just another cog in a broken machine, but his apology felt genuine. "It's not enough to apologize, Sergeant," she said finally. "You had the chance to stop Marshall before things got out of hand, and you didn't take it. That's something you'll have to live with." "I know," Jenkins replied, his voice heavy. "I've already submitted my resignation. I can't, in good conscience, stay in a system that enables people like him." The admission caught Ava off guard. She had expected excuses, deflection, but not this. "Resigning doesn't fix the problem," she said. "If you want to make a difference, stay. Use your position to push for change. Walking away might feel like the right thing to do, but it won't help the people who come after me." Jenkins was quiet for a long time before he finally spoke again. "I'll think about it," he said. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry. And I hope you know that not all of us are like him." "I know," Ava replied, though her tone was distant. She ended the call shortly after, her mind already moving to the next steps. By the end of the week, the investigation into Marshall's actions had expanded to include his entire department. Whistleblowers came forward, emboldened by the attention the case was receiving, revealing years of corruption and misconduct that had been buried under layers of bureaucracy. Marshall himself remained defiant, claiming that he had been doing his job and accusing Ava of manipulating the situation to her advantage. But his bluster rang hollow in the face of overwhelming evidence, and it was clear that his career was over. For Ava, the resolution was bittersweet.